faster than any other time in history, that maybe we're a little more jaded and don't feel things are so magical anymore and would like things to be a little easier, just put in our hand because we're used to that. So there's that too. We talked about.
But I'm going to interrupt real quickly just for a moment. Okay, but something else that has happened is when you look at, and again, the reference to younger folks, what we consider, and I'm considerably older than you, but what we consider, oh, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. And I take my cell phone and I go, this used to be a television studio that occupied a square block on the west side of Manhattan to get the lighting and the electricity and get it broadcast and now it's a miracle. It's in my pocket and I use it every day. So it's the mindfulness of that as you approach, new products and new opportunities and new kinds of things. What is the magic here that we are selling? Not just the magic inside of people's minds who are looking for magical solutions, but what is this? What have we got here?
Now, going back along those lines, going back to Neil Gaiman's American Gods, whether you've watched the TV show or read the books, for those of you who are listening, it's very interesting if you're in business or marketing to watch that, even if it's not your type of thing. I happen to be a big fan, but he writes some amazing things. He's mostly written for children, believe it or not, but he writes some really amazing things for adults. And he had done a Norse mythology story, taking the facts and made it into more of a one whole narrative. And that inspired the American Gods while he was taking a trip around the country, a road trip, and every landmark they stopped at, these weird little roadside attractions and things like that, he wrote a scene about that landmark. So it's really, very quirky and everything. But the idea of it was that these landmarks are almost temples. These are places that the gods can gather. And there's new gods because we brought the old gods with us here as immigrants to America specifically. And the new gods are the new things we worship. So the old gods are like, hey, nobody's worshiping us anymore. We're losing some of our power. And these new gods like, materialism, technology, money, success, those were the new gods that were created out of what we as humans were worshiping. So that obviously was the first thing I thought of when I was looking at your book and the excerpts, because that's so close to what this talks about. It almost explains why that would happen. So what are we looking at for gods now outside of protection and all that? Status is important because it means you belong, it means you have power, it means you have leadership. I'm thinking specifically of the story you told me about your father's car. Can you share that with our listeners? Because that was a really good example of this.
Sure. And the car goes back, just to recap, when we began this conversation, you and I, of semiotics, of symbols and what is signified by the symbol. I can tell the story very quickly. I was first made aware of the importance of automobiles when I was 5 years old. It's in the book. I was watching the Walt Disney show on television, and the show was being advertised by Rambler. And most of our viewers probably don't remember there was American Motors, and they made a car called the Rambler, which was an economy car everybody could buy. And I would watch the commercial, and I turned to my dad and I said, "What? That looks pretty neat, Dad. Can we get one?" And he looked at me and he looked down his nose at me and he said, "No, we're not the kind of people who buy Ramblers." That was the end of the conversation. But that planted the seed in me.
Not Rambler people. Got it.
What's all this about? And then I observed my father. His entire life he bought Oldsmobiles, and I uncover, that the Oldsmobile, which was one of the General Motors cars, they had Oldsmobiles and Buicks and Pontiacs and Cadillacs. The Oldsmobile was specifically marketed by their marketing team to what they called something like the accomplished professional. And when I, and as I unpacked this with my father, it was, oh yeah, I don't drive a Cadillac because that means I'm ostentatious and I'm showing off my money. I don't want to do that. Okay. and there were connotations that certain ethnic groups that drove Cadillacs he didn't want to be associated with.
Well, that
And
was
then there were,
ridiculous
there was
idea at the time, right?
the
Yeah.
Buick and the Pontiac and the Chevrolet, all of which, were not his kinds of people. The Buick was like my Uncle Ted, who was a salesman. And, it's a good car for a salesman, but not, my dad was an executive, kind of thing. And when he died, there was an Oldsmobile in his driveway. He had been loyal to it for, as I say in the book, 27 years, because it matched his self-image. And so, that's what branding can do for us, is create these kinds of fierce loyalties to something that if you take off the paint and the logo, the Oldsmobile and the Buick and the Cadillac and the Chevrolet were the same. It was the same thing.
Yeah, a lot of them have the same motors, right? Like you can get a Porsche motor in a car that's not a sports car. It's just
right.
The platforms of the motors are often very much the same, but you just don't realize that as the average person. I happen to, my husband used to be in the automotive industry, so I know these things. Yeah, so he's like, he pops those and he's like, this is the same thing as everything else, but it's what's around it, the safety features, the frame, et cetera, as well. So you've got the Oldsmobile as a status symbol, and two things
as an appropriate status symbol.
Appropriate. I like appropriate status symbol. I am giving you specifically who I am, and you can't misinterpret that, because I don't want to be associated with certain groups I may not like. I don't want to be associated with someone who makes less money. So I'm not going to say your father was a snob directly, but he obviously didn't get that. So hey, good. But talk about the Mad Men era. That really sounds like the TV show.
We discussed my father for 3 minutes, and you've got him in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, I think your father made that very clear with his Oldsmobile. So, and his feelings about it. So that related to now, that's not a new or disappeared idea. That idea is still there. When they first introduced the Prius, they sent out a poll and asked people why they bought it. And when it first came out, so nobody knows if there's glitches, nobody knows how well it works. It was incredibly expensive. But when it first came out, the results were, and I heard this reported several places, people bought it because I like what it says about me. Not it's saving me gas. That might have been a high reason, but the most popular, highest ranking reason in their poll was I like what it says about me. Now that has changed. People don't buy it for that reason anymore, because of course they've continued to study it. And that's, that was your dad. That was your father and his Oldsmobile. He likes what it says about him and what it tells people. So that hasn't changed. So there's no reason to dismiss that idea in your current brand marketing, no matter what you're selling. Is what does it say about them that they chose your product? Is it showing they're adventurous, like a Jeep? Is it showing that, which used to be AMC, right? And is it showing that, you are, an adventurous, really wealthy person, Land Rover, or if you are, et cetera, et cetera. So no matter what you're selling, car or not, you want the person to know that your product expresses who they are to other people if it's something that's public like that. And that's important. And that has to do with archetypes too. I want to show that I am blessed and grateful in life, and by the God that I choose, whatever materialistic God I'm following right now, I want to show that God is blessing me to, again, very tenuously take it back to the archetypes. And you talk a lot about that too, in logos and Volvos too, cars and, research and the addition of the BMW logo to a Toyota. We've all seen the people who've been in the commercial and served a McDonald's hamburger in a fancy restaurant, and they all talk about what a great, bespoke burger it is, and it's just a quarter pounder, because it's the atmosphere. It's the atmosphere they put it in, and it's no longer this quickie food. So they're saying, hey, it's quickie food, it's cheap, but it's also just as good as restaurant food. Jury's out, but how you market your product and how you surround it matters. It really matters. So a lot of that is really, really interesting to me in that part. So And yeah, there's some partying stuff in here. I noticed that, you mentioned Plato's Retreat. We're not going to get into that. But it just shows that, sex sells, image sells, money sells. And it's, again, there are gods of partying, Janus and others. And, they did not want to be left out of the conversation currently either. So getting away from cars, how else do you see a way to leverage this kind of transformational journey for a person when they see a brand? Such as, I mentioned that Bluetooth, and I didn't know this, so I thought this was really cool. Bluetooth was actually the name of a Viking in history. I don't know if he was real or not, but he was actually in history. I believe he was real. I haven't looked it up. And Bluetooth's logo is actually the Viking. If you look at it closely, that's like a Viking rune. And Bluetooth was based on that. So they're already coming from a position of here's a Norse archetype of a strong, stable Viking. But if you don't know it, it's just the little squiggly blue thing on your phone. And I thought that was interesting that they, in regards to this conversation, that they picked a Viking as their brand.
I think it was Young who said, famous quote, and it is him. It is Young. He had it carved in the entryway to his house up in Switzerland someplace. But it says, "Invited or not, the gods will be present." And so if Neil Gaiman was part of this conversation, he would explain that this Bluetooth guy wanted to be part of the conversation. That's why
it's there. Right now, if you're listening,
I'm not advocating that.
I hope he's listening. Yeah.
Need to embrace the philosophy. I go back again to the concept of as if. But I also, I do this with everyone. Regardless of your belief system, just be open to the possibility that there's an energy that's trying to tell you something. Mm-hmm. And if you get that sense, take a minute, and see if something's going on here or not. And that's so many things that people say it was intuition, it was a lucky guess. I don't know why I chose that. We just don't know what role the complexities of the energies in the world in which we live, how they fully operate.
Yeah, our human brain. We don't even know how that picks things up. That sense of knowing somebody's staring at you when they're completely out of your eye line, I don't think that's ever been explained. I'm not even sure they can figure out why we yawn. So, we have to assume that there is a lot more going on upstairs with our brain chemistry alone, let alone the spiritual part of it. So whether you're spiritual or not, something is going on that we can't explain everything. Can't explain it.
And the brain chemistry alone, there is so much stuff packed away into our brain's memories cells and such, that sometimes we don't voluntarily know where to look to find it. But deep in the brain, some little molecule says, no, you should be thinking about this. And they push it to the top, And
sometimes you've got too much stuff getting pushed to the top that's not important. So you're not sure what you're listening to. And it's interesting that we're talking about listening to your brain, because you had mentioned earlier in this conversation that sometimes there's connections that people make that you don't even realize, and you want to listen and analyze and ask the consumer what they think of your brand or what they're also interested in to find, new ways to take that direction. And I just read an example yesterday in a marketing book that Tom's, the shoe company, did social listening, which is not for those who aren't familiar, it's actually going in and having your community manager know what people are talking about and use human eyes to not only answer people, but to look and see what they're talking about in the threads and figure out what it is they're talking about in your community when it's not your product. And they were amazed and surprised to find a large percentage of people talking about My Little Pony. And so they came out with a My Little Pony themed Toms, and it sold out. Like, it just flew. It just galloped away in this little rainbow sparkly way. And they would never have known that if they weren't paying attention to what the consumers were saying. So the consumers were requesting something without even knowing they were requesting